originally secret teachings and came to be made public. So the basic aim of thought transformation teachings is to develop the two bodhicittas. So the two bodhicittas are relative bodhicitta and absolute bodhicitta. So relative bodhicitta relates to that mind I was talking about, the precious thought to want to enlighten, to become enlightened yourself in order to be able to enlighten all other living beings. And there are various techniques in Tibetan Buddhism for achieving that. The main ones are the 7-point Mahayana cause and effect method. And the one that's more related to thought transformation teachings is called equalizing and exchanging self for others, which is a more direct method that doesn't involve quite so many Buddhist beliefs. And that's the one that's emphasized in thought transformation teachings. And absolute bodhicitta relates to emptiness, an understanding of emptiness. So these teachings became public, and then in probably the earliest 20th century, this Nyung Nay, Decryption Richey, composed this text called Turning Suffering and Happiness into Enlightenment. So before actually addressing the topics of the text, I just briefly went through the 4 usual preliminaries before thought transformation teachings, which were appreciating our present position of our body and mind, having a relatively healthy body and mind and the opportunity to pursue a spiritual path, our need for an awareness of impermanence and death, and we've just had a timely reminder of that. Some basic introductions to karma, and then the need to understand the nature of our actual existence, that it's a suffering existence, and not to see it as a pure land or a beautiful park, but more as a prison. So now we come to the text itself. So we're down to just after the foreword. So Decryption Richey says there are 2 parts for this text: how to use suffering as the path and how to use happiness as the path. And each one is approached firstly through relative truth and then through absolute truth. So that absolute truth again is referring to emptiness. So he begins by talking about how to use suffering as the path to enlightenment, and first through relative truth. So Decryption Richey says, whenever you are harmed by sentient beings or anything else, if you make a habit of just perceiving only suffering, then when even the smallest problem comes up, it will cause you enormous anguish in your mind. This is because the nature of any perception or idea, be it happiness or sorrow, is to grow stronger and stronger by being repeated. When the power of this repetitive experience gradually increases, after a while, most of what you perceive will become the cause of actually attracting unhappiness towards you, and happiness will never get a chance. If you do not recognize that it all depends on the way in which your mind develops that habit, and you put the blame on external objects and situations alone, then the flames of suffering, negative karma, aggression, and so on will spread like wildfire without end. This is what is called all appearances and perceptions arise as enemies, which means the whole world turns hostile. So this is just talking about the power of habit, which we all know. And so, of course, there's positive habits and negative habits. So a negative habit that we often develop is just to see everything as a problem or as a suffering. And my clearest example of this was when I was a horrible teenager. If my mum was alive, I would apologize to her, but I think most teenagers are horrible. And I was like super sensitive to everything in the environment. You know, like everything was either too loud or too bright or too this or too that. And I had a younger brother who I'm sure at the time I was convinced did it deliberately. We'd be watching TV together and he would be in the armchair and he would tap his fingers on the armchair. And I would be livid, you know, I'd be almost beside myself. In our family, you did not express anger. We weren't an angry family, but I was livid. And just occasionally I would burst out and ask him to stop. I don't think he was doing it to torment me, but I saw it as torment. And whenever I read this about all appearances arising as an enemy, I think of myself as a teenager, and that's how it was. Everything irritated me. Nothing was right. Nothing anybody could do was right. Nothing anyone could say was right. And of course, it was all to do with my own uncontrolled mind and hormones. But at the time, yeah, that's what we tend to do. We tend to externalize our problems and sufferings. And the thing that I find really changed my worldview were reading these Buddhist teachings where you have to accept responsibility for everything that happens to you. And I'm not saying I do that, because I don't. I've just had an example this week of getting angry with someone and following that same pattern. And it was incredible. I mean, I was reading all these teachings on thought transformation in preparation for this course. And in my mind, every second I had was thinking about what that person had done and why it irritated me so much. And it was only yesterday, after I read something particularly profound, that I was able to let go of it a little. But if they come back in my line of view, it'll come back. So it's like habit, a habit of mind. And our habit, and in Buddhism, you have to remember we have this wide spectrum. We're not just thinking about this life. And we know those of us who've had habits that we had to break in this life, how difficult it is. You know, if anyone's been a smoker or you know, mildly addicted to other things, how hard it is to stop those habits. Just imagine, from our viewpoint, we've got countless lifetimes of bad habits, also some good habits, hopefully, but a lot of negative thinking and negative acting. And so it's almost like we're habituated to this instinctive reaction of blaming something outside when things go wrong for us. And just think about it in your own lives. It's so easy to do. We do it all the time. And the thing that Buddhism, what rocked my world, was this having to take responsibility. And that's what I ended up doing, analyzing the current situation I'm angry about, is that I had to apply all these methods and accept that, I mean, we all know it, who are Buddhists, whatever is happening outside is a condition. And the cause for our suffering is in our mind, in our heart mind. There's nothing out there. So in the early days here in the nunnery, the nuns used to have a joke when we would stir each other up and someone would get angry, would say, just remember, I'm a condition, not a cause, you know? And that's it. The anger is there, the attachment is there, the ignorance is there, the jealousy is there, all those things are there. And one advice that Geshe Tashi Tsering, who's now known as Khensa Rinpoche, who has a center in Brisbane, who's a brilliant teacher. He was resident here for 19 years. And some of the things he said just lodged in my mind, hopefully not only for this life, but future lives. And he said that, you know, in terms, it's like we're baby practitioners. We have to recognize that, you know. And he said in terms of things like attachment and anger, and especially attachment, it's like we really hate the suffering that comes from those situations, but we're so attached to the causes of them, the conditions for them, you know? So it's like, as a baby practitioner, the first advice you're given, for example, if you've got someone that just is the condition for your anger and you really can't control your mind, the first advice that's given is called separate from the object, right? Just walk out, just don't see that person if it's possible. Of course, that's not always possible. If you're in family or living situations where you've got to see that person every day, you need a stronger method to deal with it. But one of the strong objects of any delusion, if you can't apply an antidote, if you can't apply a remedy, if you don't know the remedy, then the first step is to separate from the object, so that it's not freshly coming up in your mind in an obsessive way all the time. And if you're separate from the object and you calm down, you can actually start to think about the situation and apply some methods. But if you stay in the situation and just get angrier and angrier, because the cause is there in your mind, it's not, they're just a condition, which is hard to accept when you feel someone's done something really bad to you, you know, or something that's unfair. It's so hard. I just noticed your moustache. That's very good. It's very hard to accept responsibility for it, you know, because it doesn't seem like we created the cause. But of course, in Buddhism, we have this vast perspective where even in this life, you know, the cause probably isn't in this life, because in terms of karma, there are some karmas that ripen in this life, but they're seen as exceptional ones. You know, I mean, in the 70s and 80s, well, more the 70s, there were all these songs about instant karma. So in Buddhism, it's seen there's very little instant karma. There's not so many things where you do the action in this life and you experience the effect or the result in this life. There are some, particularly in terms of strong negative or strong positive thoughts, and also in relation to what we call special holy objects, you know, that can ripen in this life. But most things, you do something in this life and it ripens in a future life, and it can ripen in the next life, or it can ripen after many, many lives. There's no way, unless you've got Buddha's omniscient mind, there's no way of knowing that. So it's not that in terms of things happening to us that we can look in this life and say, usually, and say, oh, that's why that happened. Not that we have the omniscient mind that can see it anyway. Chances are, in a previous life, we created the cause for that particular effect. In some ways, doesn't matter. We still have to deal with what's happening to us. And so a good thing, and what I kept reminding myself of this week, was that everything comes from my own mind, you know? And there's two ways of looking at this. One way is the immediate one of everything comes from my mind because I label it in a certain way, right? So this objective situation that happened with me this week, it was my choice what I labeled it, especially as a Buddhist who's been reading books on thought transformation, you know, I mean, every one of them is telling me the same thing, that I have a choice. It comes from my mind, that rather than seeing it as that person's fault and obsessing about their negative traits, I had the opportunity, of course, to see it as a perfect opportunity for thought transformation, for mind training, to see it as an opportunity to practice patience. But of course, what happens with us is somehow we have this kind of self-righteousness about our anger. We often feel justified because that person did that thing that was so bad. We feel justified, and we don't want to actually, although our anger feels uncomfortable, I think our ego's there thinking, no, 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 you know, I'm justified in being angry about this. And so we don't want to look at the antidotes. We don't want to look at the remedies. We don't want, because somehow we want that person to be at fault, and we want to be able to spew out, or, you know, at least mentally spew about what they've been doing. So what we have to know in every situation is that we have a choice about the label. And there's many New Age slogans that, you know, follow this, which doesn't mean, you know, it's not true. But, you know, you have a choice about whether you label some situation as positive or negative. And so especially when you're trying to transform your mind, when you're trying to develop your mind in the path, then it's like Lama Rinpoche's cook, you know, you go out of your way when you're really practicing, you go out of your way to find the, you know, you appreciate it when you have something difficult happen, because it gives you a chance to apply these methods and to transform your mind. Rather than becoming angry, you think about the positive things, the antidotes, the remedies, and diffuse your anger. So it took me quite a few days to manage that. And the object has separated from me, so there's no guarantee it won't come back. And the other way that it comes from your own mind is a longer term view, where it comes from a karmic cause that you've created. You know, that particular thing you're having difficulty with, that particular thing you're seeing as a problem, you created the cause for it. So there's nothing and no one to blame for anything that goes wrong in your life, right? It's you've created the cause, whether earlier in this life or in previous lives, for whatever you're experiencing. And so in Shantideva's chapter on patience in A Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, which I highly recommend everyone to get a copy and read, that's the way he deals with how you develop patience, is you trace it back. So he gives the example of someone hitting you with a stick, right? And you get angry because you didn't do anything that justified being hit by a stick, and someone hit you. And so then he just like has this calm analysis of the situation. So he says, okay, so that person hit you with a stick. Why aren't you angry with the stick? Because that's what actually hit you and hurt you, right? And of course, there's this debate going back and forth of logical reasoning on both sides. So you say, well, the stick wouldn't have hurt me if that person wasn't wielding it, right? And that's logical. And then Shantideva says, but that person who hit you with a stick, he was under the control of negative karma and delusions, you know? So that's why he hit you. So why aren't you angry with his negative karma and delusions, particularly his delusions? Because it's out of his anger or resentment or whatever that he's hit you. And then he takes it a step even further back and says, actually, you should be feeling compassion for that person, because by generating that delusion and doing that negative action of hitting you and hurting you, they're creating the cause for their own future suffering. So you can see, you know, of course, that's going to change your attitude towards them, right? And I think in many situations where we're feeling anger particularly, it's like, if we can do that, it's helpful, you know, that none of us are responsible in some ways. We're all crazy. We're not responsible for what we're doing. We're under the control of karma, negative karma and delusions. We're like someone who's possessed. We're not, we like to think we're independent. We like to think we're making free choices, but we're not, you know, so much is influenced by karma. So by doing this, and I think in anger, what I try to do now is to kind of think about the context of that person. And this comes in terms of equalizing and exchanging self for others. So equalizing, you start off in this process by developing a mind of equanimity, which is like leveling a field before you plant it, right? So what we know is, because of the partiality of our minds, we tend to be very enthusiastic and eager to help those people we love or we regard in a positive way. And we don't have the same feeling about people we don't like or have harmed us or hurt us in some way. You know, they're kind of, and then there's a whole vast number of people we've had no particular interaction with and we could care less about. So you do specific meditations where you focus on, first you focus on someone you feel positive about, whether it's a family member or a friend. And there are different ways of meditating to try to get an equanimous, even mind. So one thing you can think about is, say you've got a friend who's a close friend now, and then you think about, and to me, it often seems like a business arrangement, some of our relationships, you know, as long as someone is nice to us, agrees with our ideas, gives us little gifts, you know, keeps our ego up, then we see them in a positive way. And, you know, we want to help them. We cherish them. And then you think about the fact that, and you know from your own experience, for me, especially in school, think of all those changeable relations you had in school, where, you know, 1 minute someone's your best friend and the next minute they're your worst enemy and you never want to talk to them again. It takes so little, we're so fickle. It takes us so little to change our opinion of someone. Think about it, you know. If you have someone who's a friend, and I mean, I've seen this happen recently. So there was a friendship and one person believed in vaccines and the other was an anti-vaxxer. And those people are no longer talking to each other. They were good friends, they were close friends, but they couldn't bridge that gap, you know. And it takes so little, a difference of opinion. Maybe you want to really need some money and you ask your friend for money and they don't give it to you. That's enough. That's enough to change a relationship where you may never speak to that person again, you know. Or if they do something hurtful, they disagree with your opinion, they criticize you in some way, then it's very easy for your mind to turn. So you do that meditation. And of course, in Buddhist terms, you can do it related to this life, but of course, in terms of past lives, so many relationships with so many people, positive and negative. It's just at the moment and in this life, that person you're labeling as a friend or someone you feel positive about. And then you bring to mind a stranger, someone you pass in the street or serves you in a shop, someone you've had no particular interaction with. And again, it's because of a mind of ignorance, because you don't think about past lives and because you don't think about how easily it can happen that that person can turn into a friend or a foe. You know, it doesn't take much. One word of criticism can end a lifelong friendship. You know, one disagreement about an opinion about something can end it. So you just think again in terms of that stranger that it wouldn't take much for you to feel positive about them and it wouldn't take much to feel negative. And then you bring to mind someone you really don't like, you know, And again, in our lives, we have instances of this where we've really disliked someone. You know, sometimes it can be a complete speculative fantasy about why we dislike them. And it doesn't take much for us to change our opinion. You know, we need money and they help us. They give us a nice gift, something really thoughtful. They say something in praise of us. Then we can suddenly see them as positive. And we have experiences of these changeable relationships, you know. And then to get the real equanimity, then you think about the fact that every single living being, every sentient being, which means a being with a mind, wants happiness and doesn't like suffering. And that's exactly like you. And you'll hear this concept brought up over and over again in Buddhist teachings, especially by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Lama Zopa Rinpoche and many lamas. That's the basic understanding to have. And it's very similar to the Christian idea of putting yourself in others' place, you know. And so it's like you think about yourself and how you want every single happiness, even the tiniest happiness of, you know, a pleasant dream. And you really reject, you really want to avoid every single suffering, even the slight discomfort of having a bad dream, you know. And what you have to realize is that every single other living being is like that. They want happiness and they don't want suffering. And the thing is that we're all different. We all have different karmas. We all have different personalities, propensities, different things. And so what our idea of a pursuit of happiness or a proper pursuit of happiness is can be different from somebody else's, you know. And the thing to do also is, as much as possible, to approach people in context, you know, because it's very easy to distance yourself from someone whose story you don't know, you know. And one story, I had a friend, and he used to eat like a pig, like a dog, actually, you know, like really gross. I found it really gross, really offended my middle-class sensibilities. And, you know, I just disliked having a meal with him because he would bolt the food down just as quick as he can. And I was, you know, like this about it. And then I actually heard his story, right? And so his father and he were really competitive. His dad sounded like a horrible man, really domineering. And so if he didn't eat his meal, his dad would steal his food from his plate. So he'd have to bolt it down quickly to get it before his dad got it. And that changed my whole perspective of why he ate like that. It still revolted me, but at least I had some kind of compassion and understanding for the whole situation. So it's like we really, as Buddhists and as people who want happy lives, have to always just be checking our own mind, you know, and all the projections we have about other people, so many fantasies, and we have to see them in context. We have to realize, most importantly, that whatever's happening to us, whether we're labeling it a problem or whatever, we created the cause for it. And whatever's happening out there is a condition that is allowing our inner anger or attachment or whatever to arise. And so there's nothing to blame outside. And that's a really fundamental change in attitude. If you can reach that point where you take personal responsibility, whether you know the karmic causes or not, for whatever you're feeling. And so it comes from this long-term view of the karmic propensities, but also to understand that you have the power through your labeling to have control of whatever's happening, you know. It's a disaster if you label it a disaster. It's a problem if you label it a problem. And if you can see it in a different way, you can actually use it as fuel for your spiritual development. But of course, it's all, and I like that word training in relation to this, because that's what it needs. It needs daily training. It needs constant reminders. And of course, yeah, you slip up. You have challenges that are a bit bigger than you can manage, but you kind of still analyze the situation and see what you could have applied that you didn't apply. And if it's really a bad situation, then you separate from the object until you can apply some antidote that's positive. So it's a way of always keeping a positive view, not in some kind of idealistic way, but in a kind of reasoned, analyzed way. That if you want a calm, happy mind, these are the kind of things you have to do. because you're surrounded by potential problems, if you want to label them problems. So I'd like to read you a quote that was in a book called The Heart of Compassion by Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. He didn't say who said this originally, so I can't tell you that. Whatever difficulty may arise, the way to bring it onto the path is not to dwell on it, which will only let your thoughts proliferate. People with narrow, crowded minds are besieged by a life full of suffering, attachment, and aggression. People with relaxed minds never lose their happiness. And for me, the example I see constantly of the lamas, you know, they just, whatever disaster is happening, they just have these relaxed, happy, they're at ease with themselves and with what's happening, you know, whereas we tend to get really tight and want to change the situation. And it's said that you would have all heard, I think, of Milarepa, the famous Tibetan yogi. So it says he's often depicted with his right hand at his ear. And so that's said to mean that he's everything he hears, he's taking as Dharma advice, as spiritual advice, as opposed to this alternative way of seeing everything arising as an enemy. He sees everything as advice for his spiritual practice, whatever he hears in his environment. So I think that would be an ideal situation. So next, Decryption Richey says, you should arrive at a very precise understanding that the whole reason why sentient beings in this degenerate age are plagued by so much suffering is all to do with this weakness of their discriminating awareness. So one thing to explain here is this term degenerate age also. So any of you who've had contact with Hinduism will know that this age is seen as the Kali Yuga, and in Buddhism, it's seen in similar terms. So it's said, well, there was a previous golden age, but it's said that this age is deteriorating or degenerating. And they said that they're usually called 5 degenerations. So what's said is that basically the whole world, the environment is degenerating. And I think at the moment, we wouldn't argue with that, given the different things connected with climate change and the pandemic that are happening. It's also said that people's minds are degenerating, which means they're getting kind of more and more delusions arise more easily and are stronger. It's said that lifespan is degenerating. Now, when I first heard this, I was a bit, no, that's not right. And then shortly after that, of course, there was the AIDS epidemic. And before they got the treatment that could contain it, I was reading about countries in Africa where the average lifespan was 30 or 40 years. And I thought, oh, okay, that's, it's in line with this being a degenerate age. And then later, more lately, I've heard, and you would have all heard too, how they're saying that the next generation will live shorter than the current generation because of changes in lifestyle and exercise habits and diet and environmental pollution and different things. So this concept of degeneration of lifespan that I first rejected, I now can accept, you know, that yes, and given pandemics and different things, and it could get worse. And it's said that people's views have degenerated. So what this means is that it's easier these days for people to accept wrong views about things. Like there's not so much questioning or rationality that in the text it's talking about emptiness, but we can apply it to conspiracy theories, I think, that somehow people aren't as rational maybe as they used to be before and are quite emotional about the responses and very easy for them to get involved in wrong views and believe ridiculous things. So yeah, this whole age is seen as a degenerate age, that things are deteriorating. And the reason that we have so much suffering is that we don't have the kind of logical, rational, discriminating minds that can analyze situations and come to the right conclusions about what to do to them, antidotes to apply. So the next paragraph. So not to be hurt by the obstacles created by enemies, illness, or harmful influences, does not mean to say that things like sickness can be driven away and that they will never occur again. Rather, it simply means that will not be able to become obstacles in the way of your practicing the path to enlightenment. So this is important to understand in terms of mind training or thought transformation. It's not that you're getting problems to stop, that suddenly everything's hunky-dory and you don't have problems to deal with. What thought transformation is giving you is methods, good methods to deal with the problems that you will inevitably occur. Because if you just think in terms of your own life, you know, no matter how well or things might be going for you now or how well you're feeling, you know it's not always like that. It's not always been like that, and it won't always be like that. You know, it's said that human beings are exposed to the 4 great rivers, the sufferings of birth, aging, sickness, and death, you know. So it's not that the problems evaporate because you've become a thought transformation practitioner. It's that you now have positive methods to deal with the problems that you're facing, and you're not even labeling them problems. You're labeling them as opportunities to pursue a spiritual path. So Decryption Richey says, in order for this to happen, you need firstly to get rid of the attitude of only wanting yourself not to suffer, and secondly, to cultivate the attitude of actually being joyful that suffering arises. So that's a big step. But first, let's see if we can deal on accepting it, and then later maybe we can be joyful about having problems. So first, rejecting the attitude of only wanting yourself not to suffer. Convince yourself over and over again from your own experience of both the uselessness and the bitter pain involved in regarding suffering as something purely harmful and undesirable, and how much nervous anxiety you go through simply from not wanting it to happen. At the same time, you should go over in your mind again and again the thought that from now on, whatever suffering I face, I will not become anxious, and train yourself to develop a strong feeling of courage. So again, this is this thought of habituation, how you can train your mind, how you can change your mind. And this week with the Olympics on, I kept thinking, just imagine if people put that much time and energy into training their mind as they put into training their bodies, you know? It's like, and the lamas often say this, you know, because I mean, even as a nun, I find this, it's so easy to get distracted, right? To spend your time YouTube, so many holes you can go down. And it seems so easy to do that, right? But the thought, like, if I meditate for an hour, I want to tell everybody about it because it's such a, you know, it feels like such an accomplishment, right? But for me to watch a movie for an hour and a half or 2 hours, you know, it's effortless. It's so easy to do. And it's so hard to have the habit of doing positive things with our minds. And just imagine if you were like a mental athlete, a spiritual athlete, and you trained like those kids do, the swimmers, the Australian swimmers, you know, get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and do hours and do everything towards that goal. You know, if we're doing everything towards the goal of achieving enlightenment for the benefit of others, what a different world we'd live in. But somehow it's part of, you know, the negative karma and delusions, it's part of our samsaric existence, that it seems to take so much effort. And we kind of resent it in some ways, the amount of effort we have to put into spiritual goals, which would be achieved with a lot less effort than we need to put into worldly goals, like, you know, earning $1 million or something. And so many people put so much energy into those kind of worldly goals, but there are very few, and increasingly fewer, I think, who can put that kind of energy into spiritual goals, pursuing spiritual goals, which are far more valuable for the self and for others. So what they're saying here is you have to think over and over again, you have to habituate yourself to not seeing problems as harmful or undesirable, and to actually, I mean, I think the first step is probably accepting them, but then when you progress on the path, and you see this with the lamas, they actually welcome them. You know, it doesn't perturb their minds when some big disaster happens. It's like they see it as an opportunity to practice, not as an interruption to their little goals. They see it and welcome it. which is extremely impressive, I think, and inspiring. So Lama Zopa in Transforming Problems, he has this quote about you have to kind of learn to spontaneously like problems the way that you spontaneously like ice cream. You know, that was his example at the time, but we use coffee, chocolate, whatever you like. And that's revolutionary. I mean, I can't imagine yet having that feeling when a problem occurs, because we just want it to stop. We want it to be solved. We want not to have to deal with that problem, but to actually be happy when a problem comes is revolutionary. So the next point is quite a simple but profound point that first comes in Shantideva. So Decryption Richey, the subheading is the uselessness of regarding suffering as purely harmful and undesirable. So here he actually quotes Shantideva without attributing the quote. He says, if you can do something to solve a problem, then there is no need to be unhappy about it. If you can't, then it doesn't help to be unhappy about it either. So the actual quote here from Shantideva from his patience chapter is, why be unhappy about something if it can be remedied? And what is the use of being unhappy about something if it cannot be remedied? Now, this is like really simple, right? But just think about the way that we don't apply this in our lives. You know, just think, I mean, the Nyung Nay and Kyabje texts often talk about hopes and fears. And it seems like most of our life, we're one or the other, you know, or alternating hopes and fears. And so what this is saying is just to be kind of objective and rational when a problem happens, or what you've labeled a problem happens. And so if there's something you can do about it, then there's no need to be upset, because you just do that thing that remedies the problem. And if it's some kind of situation where you can't remedy it, then there's no point in being upset, because there's nothing you can do about the situation. So it's a very simple advice, but when you think about our usual way of approaching problems, we spend so much time being anxious and depressed about situations we can't change and obsessing about them, our mind going back to them. You know, it's like if you have say a debilitating illness, a chronic illness that doesn't respond to treatment, then basically you have to learn to live with it. And thought transformation is a great way of helping you to do that. Because if you get anxious about it, if you get worried about it, if you get fearful about it, it just increases your own suffering. It doesn't resolve the issue, because there is no known solution to that issue. It just increases your own suffering in relation to not being able to accept that problem. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche said that one time in Adelaide, he was doing a retreat, and in his break times, he used to listen to talkback radio, which I wouldn't do as a relaxing activity, but he found it kind of fascinating. And one insight that he had, he said that a man came on who suffered a lot from depression. And the advice from the psychologist or the person on the talkback radio was that to accept it, to accept the depression. And Rinpoche thought this was incredible advice, you know, because there are different kinds of depression. Some of the reactive depressions, and there's endogenous depression. So sometimes those of you, me being one of them, who experience depression, you know, sometimes there can be no obvious reason for it. You know, you could be feeling really happy one day, and then suddenly it changes, and it can change for days or weeks or months. So it's so with that kind of depression where it's not reactive, it's not because you've lost a loved one or, you know, had a failure in your job, it's like seems inexplicable. So there's no point in bucking against it, because it's not a kind of, you can't see a cause of a problem that you can deal with. It's just this endogenous depression that comes up. So for your mind to relax and to be more positive, if you just accept. And of course, as Buddhists, we have an easier time accepting, because we have belief in karma, this thing that we created the cause for whatever we're experiencing. So then there's not this kind of rejection of the problems that we're facing and the blaming outside. It's like accepting that, yes, of course, we created the causes. So at least you don't have that added suffering on top of what you're already experiencing. So by accepting it, then there's a certain relaxation in the mind. And I think that relaxation possibly can help the depression to last for a shorter time. So next subheading is the tremendous pain and stress involved. If you don't become anxious, then the strength of mind you have will make it simple for you to bear even the hardest suffering, which will feel as flimsy as cotton wool. But if you are dominated by anxiety, even the smallest problem is absolutely unbearable, since your mind is oppressed by a continuous feeling of unhappiness. Take an example. If you find yourself thinking about a beautiful woman or man and try to get rid of the desire and attachment, then you will only wear yourself out. Similarly, by concentrating intensely on the painful qualities of suffering, you will not be able to develop any patience or endurance. So as in the instructions on sealing the doors of the senses, you must not focus on the suffering and get caught up in its characteristics, but instead get used to bringing the mind home to where it belongs and resting there in its own natural space. So that the mind resting its own natural space is a common phrase used in the Nyingma tradition. So what this is saying is that you shouldn't obsess about what you're experiencing. You should be careful about what labels you apply, and you shouldn't obsess about it. So the advice that's given is that you can't suddenly deal with big problems, right? You have to, it's mind training. So you start off short bursts, little things, and then work up. So the suggestion is that, for example, you can't expect to suddenly apply these methods to, say, the loss of a loved one, a close loved one. The thing to do is to train your mind with sort of small irritations in everyday life and train yourself to apply antidotes in small situations. So little things like road rage, for example, you don't have to get angry. Just remembering when someone cuts in or does something, you don't have to see it as a problem. You don't have to be outraged. You can offer the victory to them. You can let them go in. How much difference does it make to your life? You may be a few seconds later to wherever you're going. And to not obsess about how awful that person is, how terrible. And again, to think about context. You don't know what the situation is, why that person feels the need to cut in on you. They could have a perfectly valid reason, like rushing to see a sick one in a hospital. Who knows? Who knows what the story is? But the point is to train your own mind not to get irritated and start with the small things. Start with the little things you can deal with. And then by training your mind in that way, it gives you methods so that when the big things do happen, that you could label as a disaster or a big problem, you can apply those methods that you'd used previously and deal with it in a more positive way, not seeing it as a great disaster. So are there any questions or anything anyone would like to discuss about what we've covered? Anything that's come up at all? No? Okay, so the next heading that we're going into, which we won't have time to finish before lunch, but we'll complete this afternoon, is how we cultivate an attitude of being joyful that suffering arises. So Decryption Richey says, practice developing a sense of joy out of seeing suffering as a help on the path. Whatever suffering comes up, if you do not have some kind of practice to apply each time and one that fits the ability of your mind, then it will be very difficult to succeed. You may spend a lot of time contemplating the general notion that to have this skillful means and to use suffering as a path can bring a certain benefit, but the end result will be further apart than the earth from the sky. Therefore, use suffering as a basis for the following practices. So here, Decryption Richey is about to go into 6 or 7 methods that you can bring to mind when you're experiencing something you regard as a suffering or a problem. So these are all methods to see a suffering or a problem as a positive thing in your life. So the first one is to use suffering to train in renunciation. So I'll explain the Buddhist concept of renunciation in a minute after I've read the relevant paragraph. Acknowledge that for as long as you wander in samsara powerless and without any independence, the suffering that will arise is not something unjust or unfair, but that it is the very nature of samsara. Also, if it is so very difficult to bear even the little suffering and pain of the happy realms, then there's no point in even mentioning the suffering of the lower realms. Let a deep sense of sadness and disillusionment arise by thinking, alas, samsara is an endless and bottomless ocean of suffering, and turn your mind in the direction of liberation. So this is repeating basically what I explained in relation to the preliminary of seeing our current existence as a suffering realm. Not to see it as a beautiful park, but to see it as a prison. So of course, this isn't the way we've been brought up to see the world or to want the world to be. But in Buddhist terms, it's being realistic about the nature of our existence, the nature of our experiences of life, that it isn't a beautiful park, that when sufferings or problems arise, it shouldn't be any surprise, you know, because we're often surprised when something goes wrong, and there's all that thing of, why me? Why did this happen to me? But if you're thinking with a Buddhist overview, you'd be thinking, why not me? Why wouldn't this happen to me? If you're accepting that you have countless lives of doing negative things, generating negative thoughts, then why wouldn't it ripen as a suffering or a problem, especially if you haven't done anything in terms of purification and developing your mind in the spiritual path? So this is the first method you can, so renunciation is rather an old-fashioned term. So what you have to understand is the first translators of many Buddhist texts and terms were actually Christians. So Jesuits and different orders of, particularly Catholic orders in past centuries, went to Tibet with the hope that they could convert Tibetans to Christianity. They weren't very successful, but they did translate many Buddhist terms and texts. And so I think the renunciation comes from that Christian background. So more modern translators or interpreters translate the Tibetan word for renunciation as determination to be free. So, and that works quite well in this. So if you have what you're seeing as a suffering or a problem arise, and it reminds you that it's no surprise to experiencing a problem or a suffering because it's the nature of the cycle of existence you're caught in, then it can inspire you to wish to be free from that suffering cycle. So that's this thought of renunciation that's translated here as renunciation. So developing this strong wish to be free from this suffering cycle. So a suffering or problem is just a reminder of the nature of what you're caught in. And what it does is prompt you to develop a strong wish to be free from that kind of suffering. And so if you think about why you're experiencing suffering, if you have this belief in karma, then you're going to think carefully about the way you're living your life and want to generate positive thoughts and do positive actions, because that will result in happiness as opposed to suffering or problems. So any problem or suffering that you experience can help you to develop this mind of what's called renunciation, or the determination to be free from this cycle of suffering. So we'll just do the next one, the second one, and then we'll take a break for lunch. So another way that you can see suffering or problems in a positive way is to use them to train in taking refuge. So again, this is a Buddhist concept, but if you're not Buddhist, it doesn't need to be related in a Buddhist way. You can relate it to your own religion. So Decryption Richey says, think that throughout all my lives, one after the other, the only source of refuge from the continuous pain of all this fear, which will never fail, is the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, the three jewels. So I must rely on them totally. And whatever happens, I will never renounce them. Make this into a firm conviction and then do the practice of taking refuge. So this, as I said, is in line with Buddhist practice. And you become a Buddhist or an inner being by taking refuge, usually in a formal ceremony in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So Buddha, the fully enlightened being, Dharma, his teachings, and Sangha, the ordained Sangha, monks and nuns who are all supporters of the Buddha's teachings, who are known as the three precious sublime ones, or the three jewels. So as Buddhists, we rely on these, on Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and also Guru can be included there for protection from suffering and problems. And so we do the practice of taking refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So if you have another religion, you could take whatever your refuge is in that religion. You can take refuge in whatever that is, whether it's Jesus Christ, Allah, whatever. That when you have a suffering or problem, what it can remind you of is the need for your spiritual path. Because I think what we all find is that when things are going well in our lives, when we're feeling happy, then everything's fine. We don't think about spiritual practice as much, I think, because why would we? Everything's fine, enjoying yourself. But it's often when we have some kind of crisis in our life, whether it's because we lose someone or we fail in some way, that we turn and look for some kind of spiritual refuge. And particularly at those times we're questioning the meaning of life and the meaning of our experiences. And so having a problem can just prompt us to do some spiritual practice. Because if you've taken refuge, if you rely upon Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, Guru, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, then when you're in trouble, you can rely upon them for protection. And so in Buddhist terms, this is the practice of taking refuge, but you can take refuge in whatever spiritual beliefs you have, whatever you see as a protective entity in your life. So I'll stop there and continue with the other methods after lunch, because I think, Kathy, do you want to make an announcement? So Kathy is our acting spiritual program coordinator, so probably going to fill us in on COVID details.
Am I on? Thank you. I think you've all heard a reasonable amount about what's going on, the announcement this morning. I don't really have very much to change in that. I just want to confirm for you all that the lockdown starts at 4 o'clock this afternoon. So you're supposed to all try to be home by then. Once you are home, you're not allowed to go further than 10 kilometres to do your shopping or whatever until Tuesday at 4 o'clock. So I believe that Venerable Ailsa has announced to you that she will continue with the course. When you get home, you can go on to the Zoom connection, which you should all have. Does anybody not have the Zoom connection? Okay, see me later before you go. But you can have lunch at the cafe as you booked for it, and then straight after lunch go home, and you should all be home by the 4 o'clock. Yes, yes. Well, if you've got the Zoom link, you've probably got the YouTube link as well. Is that clear for everybody? If it's not, if you don't have it, you go to Shenrezi Institute's website and click on this course on the calendar, and all the details are there. So it's fine, you can access them easily there. Anybody else have any questions about this? Thank you all very much for your cooperation in this. We're kind of getting used to it now. So, because I won't be able to be here tomorrow, and neither will Jen, I'd like to say thank you very much to Elsa.
In anticipation of the course finishing.
In anticipation, yes. Thank you very much, Elsa.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
And thank you to all the students, both for your donations and for your presence. Thank you.
So enjoy your lunch and have a safe trip home. And yeah, I will finish the course in due time. Well, we're skipping the discussion group and then I'll do according to the program. So 2:45 and to 3:45, yeah. And tomorrow we'll follow the program and we'll try to do the discussion depending how many questions come from people. You know, if there's enough questions to justify doing a separate discussion group, we'll do that. Otherwise, we'll just follow the teaching program. Yeah.